Hey guys, I'm Sahil and I'm a co-founder of Paradigm alongside my friend and colleague Rahul. Together, we created Paradigm to prepare you for change. At Paradigm, we aim to educate you on topics that are essential yet neglected in school and university. These are topics that are essential when you make a transition to the real world. Just before we start, we want to let you know that this podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and other podcast platforms. And be sure to check out our Instagram page at Paradigm Edu for more updates and our website paradigmedu.org or paradigmedu.org for detailed understanding of the topics we discuss. Today, I'm alongside Arnav, who is a specialist in the topic we'll discuss today and is a senior partner at Paradigm.
Hey guys,
Arnav,
I'm Arnav,
yeah.
and yeah, as Sahil mentioned, I'm a senior partner here at Paradigm, and looking specifically at personal finance. I'm a student at year 13 in Dubai, studying in Dubai, and yeah, I'm just looking forward to having a fruitful discussion with Aditya, where I hope you guys can learn some stuff that's useful to you.
Yeah. Today we'll be discussing credit cards, credit scores, financial aid, and student discounts with our guest Aditya. So if you don't mind, Aditya, could you please introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. So thanks, Sahil. Thanks, Arnav. Look, thanks for having me. And by way of introduction, I am a second year MBA student doing my MBA at Haas in Berkeley. I spent 5 years between undergrad and business school working in payments with Mastercard. And so do have, having lived in the US and also some of my work experience being in payments and financial services more broadly. I do have some experience with the topics that we're going to be discussing today. So credit cards, student loans, discounts, financial aid, and so on. So looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, that's good. So let's start out. So when you started out, when you went to the US for your undergrad and then your postgrad, so when you started out, how did you go about getting a credit card?
Sure. So, I think one of the first things that most international students do when they reach the US, in this case, because I studied there, is you'll open typically a bank account with a local domestic bank. In my case, I opened up a bank two accounts with Bank of America. One was a current, or what they call a checking account, and then the other was a savings account. And that's kind of the entry point into your banking relationship and almost serves as the foundation for anything that you get or that you'd apply for in the future. Having said that, I couldn't immediately get a credit card, and a US issued credit card. So most issuers in the US, and by issuers, I mean banks or financial institutions, most issuers require either a social security number, for which you typically need some kind of a job in place in order to get, or they require an ITIN, which is an international tax identification number, which I think has another process associated with it. And so, since I just joined, as a freshman, without having a job, obviously, it's very difficult to get a credit card. And so, I actually first got my US issued credit card entering my senior year of college, which was right after my internship or my summer internship between my junior and senior years. So I applied through Bank of America because that's the bank that I had that banking relationship with for a credit card. And that again, having that banking relationship really helped me in getting that credit card. And again, I'll pause here because having said that, I know a lot of banks today do have special, opportunities to get US issued credit cards for international students. And you may be able to get those even before you have a social security number or a job.
Right. Um, so that's interesting, and now we'd like to sort of look at if you're a student who's going to the US, would you even recommend that a credit card is necessary for them to go with? So, for example, could they sustain themselves with, say, a debit card or simply cash? Like, is a credit card necessary?
That's a good, no, it's a really good question. I think, in a market that's as mature or that really has a mature banking system and financial system like the US, you can certainly do without having a credit card. I wouldn't say it's a necessity in any way. You can use a debit card. There are enough ATMs all around at most major college campuses. Um, and so you certainly could, get by with a debit card and using cash. In fact, a lot of small merchants in the US, if you go to these smaller grocery stores, they typically have a minimum spend that you need to hit before you can even use a card. And they typically have those minimum spends for credit cards because it costs them more than it would cost them if you use a debit card, for instance, and obviously cash. But that's, I think, a separate issue. I think the way I would look at it is, across two lenses. If you're looking at it from a short-term perspective, um, what will happen is if you are planning to live in the US, over the next few years, it will end up being incredibly helpful to have a credit card and to have some kind of credit history, because most applications for credit, like loans, credit cards themselves, most of these applications require an evaluation of your credit or borrowing history. And so in order to build that history, you need to have a credit card. And also, in order to be considered an attractive applicant, you have to have credit history that's attractive and high quality, which means you need to be paying your bills on time, and all of that takes time. So I'd say definitely not a necessity, but something that I would recommend, especially if you're planning to live in the US and if you're looking at things from a short-term perspective. But I'd say, even if you take a step back and look at things more broadly from a longer term point of view, at some point in your life, you're likely going to take out a loan, right? You might take out a loan for a house, for a car, whatever it is. And at that point, it just helps because this is the entry point to doing that, right? You build that habit of, spending responsibly and then making sure that you pay off your monthly credit card bill. And then, if you think about it, there are obviously added benefits to credit cards, which a lot of people look at. So, be it the signing bonuses to getting credit cards that a lot of banks offer, be it loyalty and rewards, right? So if you think about it, besides the fact that, with a credit card, you have to make sure that you pay off your credit card bills every month. The only real one of the big differences between a credit and debit card is that a credit card will also give you like loyalty points and rewards. And I'd say that's, if you are going to be responsible and make sure that you're paying off your bills every month, you could treat it almost, identical to a debit card. But that's a big caveat, right? You need to be making sure that you're spending responsibly and, not just spending without any care. Cash, I would say, like I mentioned earlier, it's, in some instances with smaller merchants and specifically for low value items and ticket sizes, you might be required to use cash. But yeah, I'll stop here. But if you have any questions related to this, happy to elaborate.
No, I think it makes a lot of sense. I like credit history is also a really important aspect that we will discuss shortly. But I wanted to know, right? So going off your experiences, right? The first time you got a credit card, if you have any, I don't know, like if you had any doubts or regrets with that, learning from your experience, how would you recommend a student to get a credit card? Like, what process or track should they follow?
Yeah, so I think with this, it really depends on the individual student, but also on the individual bank that you eventually go to get a credit card. So in my case, I banked with Bank of America. For me, the process to get a credit card was quite straightforward, especially once I had a social security number. What obviously helped was the fact that I had a banking relationship with Bank of America already. So I didn't have to complete a lot of the paperwork that I would have had to if I was opening up a credit card for the first time. So I'd say, based on my experience, it is a pretty straightforward process to get a credit card. But what I would advise international students going into this for the first time would be to make sure that you enter, and again, this is something that may really not be up to you. It'll probably come from the bank side. They'll likely issue you the most basic entry level credit card, which is a good thing, right? So it might be a standard like cashback, cash rewards credit card where you get 1, 2, 3% cashback based on spends on different categories. So I'd say begin with that. And then once you've built credit history for about a year, year and a half, you'll then be eligible to apply to some of the higher reward or higher value credit cards. And there are a lot of them out there, especially in the US.
Great. Yeah, that's actually quite comprehensive and quite useful. But as Sahil mentioned, it's quite interesting that you had mentioned loans and credit history particularly, because this links rather strongly with the topic of credit scores. So tell us about credit scores. Why are they important?
Sure. So if you think about it, the credit score is one of the key ways in which people, and by people, we could be talking about institutions, we could be talking about financial institutions, about landlords when you're looking to rent apartments, when we're looking at, potentially even phone bills. So if you're taking out a phone plan in the US, if you do have a credit score or a prior credit score, which most international students don't, you actually don't have to put in the big security deposit that's associated with opening up a new phone line. So I think in general, having a credit score is important for some of these reasons, right? It's really one of the key ways in which any of these institutions will evaluate your ability to pay back the credit that you're hoping to take out from them, right? Or it's another way for them to measure risk and assess risk, because your credit score is meant to reflect the level of risk, or the level of like credit standing that you have, across all portfolios and across all holdings that you have. And so I'll pause here, but that's really why it's important. I think in the US, you have the FICO score, which is, I forget what it stands for, but it's basically, it's called your FICO credit score or your FICO credit report. And there are different agencies that provide you with those reports. And if I'm not mistaken, some of these agencies actually provide you with up to 1 or 2 free credit reports a year. This is just purely out of interest. If you want to actually view your own credit score, you're able to do that. But then a lot of the credit checks that happen on your credit scores will be initiated by different parties, right? So if you're looking to rent an apartment, your landlord will initiate a background check, and as part of that, they will evaluate your credit score. So amongst other institutions as well.
Yeah, touching up on the importance of credit scores is quite important, like getting that awareness out there. And since this is targeted mostly to students who are going to uni, or students who are already in uni, most of them would at most at max have a student loan and a credit card or a debit card. So for them, what would that credit score exactly entail?
Yeah, I think so. So I would look at it. I would look at this. I try and answer your question slightly differently. You have, your credit score is typically driven by, I think it's 5 key factors, right? So if you think about, the credit mix that you hold, which is kind of what you're referring to. So having a student loan and having a credit card, that represents, your credit mix, right? Which might be, if your credit card has a limit of $10,000 and your student loan is worth $90,000, then your credit mix is 10% credit card, 90% student loan. But I'd say the ultimate score is driven by 5 factors, one of which is credit mix, if that makes sense. So you have, and I can talk a little bit about some of these factors, right? I'd say the 2 key factors that affect your credit score are your payment history, which is the first thing that lenders will look at, right? So they'll say, what they'll want to look at is, do you have a history of paying back your credit on time and not like a day late or a month late or being overdue there? Because that will negatively impact your credit score. And I believe your payment history accounts for something like 35% of your total credit, to your total credit score. The other key factor that drives your credit score is the amount that you owe. Now that is a function both of the obviously the total outstanding balance of your credit across your different portfolios, which in this case was $100,000, but it's also a function of your level of utilization, right? So if we just look at credit cards, right? Your credit card will typically have a limit of, let's say, $10,000. And that's just purely hypothetical, right? That'll vary from student and by issuer and also by type of card. Uh, so if you have a limit of $10,000, but you are spending on average $2,000, right? So your utilization on that $10,000 limit is 20%. That's generally considered more positively as opposed to having a limit of $10,000, but you spending $9,999, because for them, what that's showing is that you're kind of at the upper end of that limit. So there's a risk that you'll basically exceed that limit. Which again, I think some of these factors are pretty subjective and they would vary by issuer. So in some cases, I think that could be perceived by an issuer as, okay, if this person's spending a lot, and let's say if they're paying back their credit on time, we may want to look at expanding or increasing their credit limit. And so those are two key factors that drive your credit score. Credit mix, as I said, is another factor that drives your score, as well as the length of time for which you've had credit, right? And that goes back to the point of being an international student and applying for your credit card only once you've had a social security number. So since you are an international student, you won't have that length of credit history, right? So it's tougher for other financial institutions to evaluate your credit score, especially when you don't have credit history. But over time, if you take out a credit card, if you're paying your loans on time, etc., you can build that credit history and you'll see your score improving.
Yeah, it's great that you also mentioned the evaluation of credit scores. I wanted to know, so when did you actually get a credit score? Was it in uni? Was it after uni? Or did you have to inquire about it on your own? So could you also tell us about that?
Yeah, I think in my case, as I said, I applied and got my first credit card. I think it was sometime after my summer internship, so entering my senior year. I then used my credit card issued by Bank of America for about a year, and I think the first time that my credit score was probably checked would have been when I applied to rent an apartment in New York, which is where I worked right after graduation. And so that's something that would have been initiated by my landlord at the time. And it's not just the landlord that you eventually rent from, but it's also if you're just applying for various rental properties, all of them will actually look at they'll do a background check, if you obviously grant them the permission to do so. So I think that's the first time that my credit score is probably pinged by them. But the first time that I viewed it would have likely been with one of my other two credit card issuers. So I had taken out credit cards with Chase and with Barclaycard, which also issued some pretty cool credit cards in the US. And as part of their platforms, they actually show you your FICO score, I think on a monthly or bi-monthly basis. So you have the ability to look at that as often as you'd like.
Right, and it's interesting that you mentioned the times when a credit score comes in use, when, as you mentioned, a landlord or general lenders are looking at you, your payment history, and the amount you owe. But so this comes and begs the question that how do you actually improve your credit score over a certain period of time, or actually when you start out?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question, because you'll see as the first time you get a credit card, your score might be lower, but then over time, just by virtue of the fact that you're not doing anything differently, you've just got a credit card now. As long as you're spending on your card and then you make sure that you're paying it on time, you'll find that your credit score will improve, all else being equal. And again, this, to answer your question, I'd go back to those 5 drivers of your credit score that I was talking about, right? So one is the payment history. So again, don't underestimate the importance of just paying your bill on time. That will help improve your credit score. If you miss your payment even by a day or two, that will negatively impact your credit score. So a lot of times, I would suggest, and I do this myself, I just set up an auto pay. I link it to my bank account and I make sure that my bill is paid off on time, because sometimes you'll invariably have things going on. You might have an assignment or a class the next day, or you might be working and you just don't have the time. You should have the time to do this, by the way, but just in case you don't, I think having an auto pay set up will it helps mitigate against the possibility of paying late. So Payment history is one, right? That's how you can increase your score when you think about payment history. But when you think of amounts owed, this is a slightly tricky one. I would say, there are two ways you could do this. One is by, increasing your credit line, right? If you have a limit of $10,000, you could always, take out a larger limit, but also make sure that you're spending more, right? And I don't know how the proportions affect that, but that's something you can certainly, research more as you actually get into this and end up getting a credit card. Length of credit history, again, the longer you have credit history for, the higher your score will be. I'll say it again, all else being equal, right? And then there's obviously credit mix, right? So I think having a diversified credit mix is more beneficial. And when I say diversified, I mean having a credit card, having a student loan, having a mortgage, having an auto loan potentially. That's not to say you should go ahead and just take out loans for the heck of it, but you should look at ways in which you can expand your credit mix. I think the last factor that drives your credit score is the new credit that you're taking out. And that relates to, like, let's say the number of credit cards that you have. And so here I would caution against, applying for every single credit card that looks attractive, and also applying to for every single credit card that looks attractive, just because you'll get these really cool and great sign-on bonuses, which will give you like free travel points and so on, which a lot of people, like doing. And I think, again, there's nothing wrong with doing that as long as you have a holistic view and you can make sure that you're paying your bills on time. And then there's also the fact that if you ever close a credit card for whatever reason, that can have the negative impact of reducing your credit score, because that ties directly to that last factor, which is new credit. So when your new credit is diminishing, then it could negatively impact your score. But I think these are the ways in which you could increase or improve your credit score.
Right, that's quite interesting. And then just taking from this concept of payments, I'm sure another question that most of our listeners who are looking to apply or head towards uni would be towards this general trend of expenses at uni and how they're getting higher every year. And so this is something that links quite strongly with financial aid. So maybe could you talk a bit about financial aid as an international student applying to the US or generally? So what exactly is financial aid?
Sure. So financial aid is essentially the funding that's provided to students, both domestic and international, to assist them in covering, the costs associated with attending college. And my understanding is that financial aid is typically either need-based or non-need or merit-based, right? And again, I think financial aid can be awarded in the form of grants, loans, scholarships, and even work-study grants. And in order, if you think about like applying for federal financial aid, students must first complete a form called the FAFSA form, which I think in most cases, if not all, is limited to domestic citizens, so US citizens. But I think there are a few opportunities for international students to avail of financial aid in various forms, right? So if you think about the different sources of financial aid, you might have federal and state government grants, which, to my understanding, again, to the best of my knowledge, is not available for international students. But if you think about financial aid that comes from educational institutions themselves, that's where international students could potentially get some form of aid. And I think a key avenue for this is the work-study program, where you might work part-time. Obviously, you need to be in compliance with your F1 visa requirements or whatever visa you're on as an international student in the US. And you should try and make sure that you're working the required or within the maximum number of hours that you're allowed to work. And you could work in, you could be a graduate student instructor or a GSI, as it's called in Berkeley. You could be a teaching assistant, a reader, a tutor. I think there are many different ways. You may even be able to support in research and get financial aid. But I think without fail, almost every institution, educational institution, will have information on how they offer financial aid and to whom they offer it, and the process for applying for it, irrespective of whether you're international student, an American student, and so on.
Right.
Right. And
Sorry, you wanna ask?
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
Sal, go ahead.
Okay. So essentially, financial aid, right? That it's a really it's a really important topic. But then there's also there are alternatives, and something that's commonly discussed is the student loan, and the debt crisis that's within the U.S. And just doing a bit of research, I know it's getting it's getting worse. So like from your knowledge, is it even worth investing in a student loan?
Yeah, I think so. That's a tough one, right? I'd say it really depends on the individual situation and your personal circumstance. You need to um, assess your ability to fund your education. You need to assess your ultimate career goals, which might be tough to do, especially going into your undergrad, where you don't most of the time you don't know what you want to do. And then you also need to assess the various sources of funding that you could get. So obviously, one source is a student loan, which is associated with typically with high interest rates. Maybe not in the environment in which we are today, or not so much, but you'd certainly be paying a premium for being an international student if you take out a loan, a student loan in the US, as opposed to taking out a federal loan for which you would then need a cosigner, a US based cosigner. So there are added complexities there, but I'd say in many cases you take out a student loan because you have to, right? But I would say, don't discount possibilities of getting financial aid. A lot of times, you may not get financial aid going into college, but you might get it once you're in college, right? So you may not get it for your freshman year, but if you work hard, if you build relationships with professors and with a network of professionals at your university, you might be able to find and carve out opportunities for yourself to do some kind of engage in some kind of work study, which will give you financial aid. But ultimately, the decision really rests with you, right? And again, you have to overlay this with what your ultimate career goals are. If you're looking to enter a field with stable or I'd say predictable returns, let's say banking or consulting, you might be able to actually forecast your personal financial situation more confidently than you could if you were entering a field that's a little less explored, right? And so if that makes sense, I'd say it would really depend on your individual circumstance. But you could certainly look at student loans, financial aid. You could also look at scholarships. I think that's another source of funding that you shouldn't discount. Being an international student, you are bringing a lot of diversity to the university that you go to. So apply, do your research when you're going in, and even once you're there, and make sure that you're considering all sources, that you are applying for all of the scholarships and financial aid opportunities on time, because that's another factor. These deadlines will just come and go, and you may miss them. So that's the advice that I would give.
Yeah, that's interesting because apart from student loans, we know the other other forms of minimizing costs where it might not be as significant, but every dollar helps out at the end of the day. So knowing that you did your undergrad at UC Berkeley, um, did you ever use student discounts to help you out?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think, the short answer is yes, I did. I think there's actually very little effort that you need to make to avail of student discounts. So it's almost like a low-hanging fruit, right? That's something you should take advantage of because you'll find plenty of opportunities to utilize student discounts in your day-to-day life. So if you think about food, right, one of the biggest expenses for college students. Um, Obviously in your freshman year, or maybe even in your sophomore year, you might be part of the college meal plans, which is in general, I think, subsidized food in any case. But if once you kind of get out of those plans, you can find restaurants and cafes on campus and maybe off campus as well that have some kind of an affiliation with Berkeley in this case, or with your university, wherever you go. And as long as you present your student ID to them, you might get a 5-10% discount. I think so. Student discount is one way you can, minimize costs. Another way is just it's another way of giving a student discount. A lot of restaurants will just have student specials, right? So they won't give it to you in the form of a discount, but they'll give you subsidized food. So it's the same kind of concept, but just applied in different contexts. And so I'd say absolutely student discounts, you should avail of them. Another area that I think you could use student discounts in is if you go to your local student store. So if you need stationery, if you need bags, books, and so on, you can. A lot of the times these stores have deals for students. But also, if you think about another key expense, right, which is books, your textbooks, you'll find you could either buy new textbooks, which in the US especially is pretty expensive, and it's tougher to, a lot of times people try to, if they know what textbooks they're going to be using for a course, with enough notice, they can actually buy those books back home and then just bring them to the US for themselves, right? Not to resell and profit on that. But if you're doing that, a lot of times you won't be able to because you don't really know what books you'll need with such advance notice. So I think one way you could optimize costs is by renting books or by buying used books. And this may sound obvious, but you'll be surprised by the number of people that don't do that. And so you could go to, like at Berkeley, we had, if I remember correctly, it was a bookstore called Ned's, and that's where we would basically buy, I think, rented books. We could rent books essentially for the semester, and you have to make sure that you maintain the quality of the books, but you'd also have the ability to buy used books. And so that's another way in which you can optimize costs.
Right. And then, so you mentioned that, yeah, so you avail student discounts at Berkeley, and it's quite an established, institution. But so some of our listeners will be wondering, are these discounts offered particularly to the school you're attending? Or are there any other, major student discount providers that they should look out for and avail? To say a smaller uni might not have a discount, or are there any other places they can get such discounts from?
Yeah, I think, my understanding is that, whichever university you go to, typically the university is a big part of the college town that you go to, right? So in Berkeley, the University of California, Berkeley, that campus is one of the drivers of business in the city of Berkeley. So you'll find a lot of local businesses. I'm not talking chains. I'm talking actually local businesses and bookstores and so on that would offer those student discounts. So I wouldn't, I'm not quite sure if there are, established restaurants or chains across the country that would offer similar student discounts everywhere. But I think the point is that a lot of local businesses will likely offer you discounts depending on where you go. And a lot of the times, all you need is your student ID. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a lot of what you said today was extremely relevant and extremely useful. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing your knowledge and experiences. And for everyone watching, make sure to stay tuned for more interviews from Paradigm. Thank you, Aditya.